Alright, let's just get this started. I'm gonna put this on, like, without the face music a little bit, and it's still got a little bit before we're actually going to get into the article, so, um, what I am going to be doing is a lot of this is going to be a lot less off of the cuff. Also, let me get centered because I turned off all of the alerts, so you guys can't tell me if I need to do mise en scène. Okay, so a lot of this is going to be a lot less off the cuff, just because of like the nature of the stream. What I do is as I wrote some stuff up, and I'm just going to read it off the script. So if it looks like I'm reading off a script, it's because I am. I'm 100%. I'm just going to be forward with you guys with that. So let's just get this started. I want to put a little bit of a disclaimer before this stream. It's going to be a very politically charged stream. There's simply no way around this. On stream, I usually try to keep it a little jokey if I get political, or just send my condolences and don't go into detail. That ain't this stream. This is not just due to the current events surrounding the Supreme Court striking down Roe v. Wade, though that's a good thing to keep in mind, especially with Justice Clarence Thomas, moments before Roe was struck down, saying that he was coming after Obergefell versus Hodges, which protects gay marriage, and Lawrence v. Texas, which protects same-sex intimacy between couples, i.e. gay sex. It's what makes gay sex federally legal. So the events that I'm going to be reading about take place before those rulings, when not just gay marriage was illegal, but gay sex, and not only gay sex, but as much as dressing in too many items of clothing not suited to your gender. It was a time when to be gay meant going to a bar run by the mafia, because those were the only people who could protect you from the cops. And we're going to be talking about what our queer foremothers and forefathers fucking did about it. The reason I'm doing this is because we got a lot of young LGBTQs in our chat, and, and our streams, and I want y'all to know the history of what happened on this night. How we got to the point that we're at, and that you can, how we got to the point that you can put pride flags in your icons without your houses being raided by cops. Because you ain't gonna be taught this in schools. And if you are, it's going to be an abridged version. And that's potentially dangerous. You guys need to know how this movement started, because this night showed us all how to fight, and unfortunately, it's not that you're going to be asked to fight again, it's that the fight never actually stopped. So, I'm going to be talking about queer liberation, and it's going to be pretty American-centric, because, I live there, and shit's going down there right now, so, yeah, this is something you're going to want to keep in mind while you're listening. Every country has different queer struggles, and today I'm going to, talk about the American ones. So here's your content warnings. There's going to be a couple of them. I might need to read this multiple times during the stream just as more people pour in, etc., etc. But, I can read these as many times as I want, but I'm going to give them here first, immediately for the people who are just in here now. The reason I chose this article is that it goes very in-depth. It is very uncompromising. It does not skirt past details. It does not sand down edges. It is extraordinarily explicit, and it lays everything down plainly. There is going to be a lot of explicit sexual discussion. Sucking and fucking is going to be talked about in this article a lot. There's not going to be an explicit sex scene or anything, but, they're going to be talking about it. There's a lot of discussion of drug use. There is going to be a lot of violence, specifically violence that the police did against queer people. And finally, there are going to be a lot of homophobic slurs. And I need everyone to understand that I'm not going to be replacing them with fettuccine like I do with Tales Gets Trolled. We're not reading a comic by an edgy 20-something, we are reading about real events. And you all know enough cock goes into this mouth that the F word can come out. And now, with all that in mind, if you decide to leave hearing any of that, you don't think you want to deal with that, you don't think you can handle that, that's fine. Again, no negative judgment on you. That's why we put these warnings here. It's so that if you ain't comfortable, you can bounce. And it's okay. And it's fine. So, without further ado, well, there's going to be a little bit of ado because I might need to do a little bit of setup. We are going to read The Night They Raided Stonewall by Martin Duberman. So now, it's time for the ado before we get to that so that I can figure out to see how I can get this to hook to the thing. Unfortunately, I'm still a little tired, but, it's whatever. Let's see. We're going to go to web browse. Boom. I'm going to leave the frickin' idiot clown. Okay, so it's just working. It's just working. There it is. There it is. Okay. Let me see if I can't zoom in on this a little bit more. I want to have this, kind of really zoomed in. There we go. Unfortunately, this is going to make it look like way longer than it is, but that's fine. That is fine. We're just gonna get the fuck into it, and we're gonna put on this fucking. Here's the thing. It took place in the 1960s. We gotta put on the sexy 60s funk music. You know we have to. We're gonna turn it down a little bit more than that. There we go. All right. Most of the employees at the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village and some of the customers did drugs, primarily uppers. Desbutol, a mix of destoxin and Nembutal, was a great favorite, though later banned by the FDA, and the bar was also known as a good place to buy acid. The chief supplier was Maggie Jiggs, a famous drag queen who worked the main bar at Stonewall along with her partner, Tommy Long. Tommy kept a toy duck on the bar that quacked whenever someone left a tip. They were a well-known team with a big following. Maggie, blonde, chubby, and loud, knew everybody's business, and would think nothing of yelling out in the middle of a crowded bar, "Hey girl, I hear you got a whole new plate of false teeth from that fabulous dentist you've been fucking." But Maggie loved people, had good drugs, and was always surrounded by gorgeous men, and arranged wonderful three-ways, so her outspokenness and even her occasional thievery were usually forgiven. You're still doing dissertation work, but will be lurking. Thank you, Frieson. I appreciate everyone who is lurking. You can lurk as much as you want, anyone. Maggie and Tommy were stationed behind the main bar, one of two bars in the Stonewall. But before you could get to it, you had to pass muster at the door, a ritual some of the customers welcomed as relief from the lax security that characterized most gay bars. That usually meant inspection through a peephole in the heavy front door by Ed Murphy, Bobby Shades, or muscular Frank Accelerone. Blonde Frankie, as he was known, was gay, but in those years not advertising it, and was famous for being able to spot straights or undercover cops with a single glance. If you got the okay at the door, and for underage street kids this was always problematic, you moved a few steps to a table, usually covered by members of what one wag called the Junior Achievement Mafia. It's a team that could mean on different nights two of the co-owners, Zucci and Mario, Ernie Segroy, who always wore a suit and tie and whose father started the famous Bonsoir on 8th Street, Vito, who was on salary directly from another co-owner, and Fat Tony Laura, who was hugely proud of his personal collection of SS uniforms and Nazi flags. He made bombs on the side. Or Tony the Sniff Vera, who had a legendary nose for no goods and kept a baseball bat behind the door to deal with them. To deal with them, and then the sentence stops. At the table, you had to plunk down $3, $1 on weekdays, for which you got 2 tickets that could be exchanged for 2 watered-down drinks. According to Chuck Shaheen, all drinks were watered down, even those carrying the fanciest labels. You then signed your name in the book, kept to prove, should the question arise in court, that the Stonewall was indeed a private bottle club. People rarely signed their real names. Judy Garland, Donald Duck, Elizabeth Taylor, these were all popular favorites. Once inside the Stonewall, you took a step down, and straight in front of you was the main bar, where Maggie held court. Behind the bar was some pulsating gel lights that went on and off, later exaggeratedly claimed by some to be the precursor for the inventive light shows at The Sanctuary and other gay discos that followed. On the weekends, a scantily clad go-go boy with a pin spot on him danced in a gilded cage on top of the bar. Straight ahead, beyond the bar, was a spacious dancing area. At one point, the bar's history was lit only with black lights that, in itself, became a subject for camp, because queens with Murney in their eyes all looked as if they had white streaks running down their faces. Should the police, known as Lily Law, Alice Blue Gown, Alice for short, or Betty Badge, or a suspected platonic or a suspected plainclothesman, that word tripped me up real fucking hard, unexpectedly arrived, white bulbs instantly came on in the dancing area, signaling everyone to stop dancing or touching. The queens rarely hung out at the main bar. There was another, smaller room off to one side with a stone wishing well in the middle and its own juice box and service bar and booths that became headquarters for the more flamboyant contingent among Stonewall's melting pot of customers. There were scared drag queens like Tommy Lang and Smith, Bertie Rivera, and Martin Boyce. Boys who looked like girls, but who, like Tommy Lang and Smith, but who knew they were boys. I just fucking read the previous paragraph again for some reason. There were the Flame, not drag queens, who wore eye makeup and teased hair, but essentially dressed in male clothes, if an effeminate version with fluffy sweaters and Tom Jones shirts. Only a few full-time transvestites, like Tiffany Spanola Jerry, a hairdresser from Sheepshead Bay, and Tammy Novak, who performed at the 82 Club, were allowed to enter the Stonewall in drag. Tammy sometimes transgressed by dressing as a boy. Not even Tish, Joe Tish, who regularly changed back into men's clothes after a performance, would be admitted in drag, though he had been a well-known drag performer since before the early 50s and late 60s, and had a long-running show with the Crazy Horse, a nearby cafe on Bleecker Street. Tish was admitted into some uptown straight clubs in full drag. There, as he sniffily put it, his artistry was recognized. The Queens considered Stonewall and Washington Square the most congenial downtown bars. If they passed muster at the Stonewall door, they could buy or cajole drinks, exchange cosmetics and the favored taboo or Amish perfumes, admire or deplore someone's latest wig, and make fun of 6-foot transsexual Lynn's size 12 women's shoes, while admiring her fishnet stockings and miniskirts, and giggling over tales of her servicing the firemen around the corner on the 10th Street station. Move constantly in and out of the ladies' room, where they deplored the fact that a single red light bulb made the application of makeup difficult, and dance in a feverish sweat till closing time at 4 a.m. The jukebox on the dance floor played a variety of songs, even the occasional Smoke Gets in Your Eyes to appease the romantics. The Motown label was still a top heap in the summer of 1969, and 3 of the 5 hit singles for the week of June 28th, by Marvin Gaye, Junior Walker, and The Temptations, carried its imprint. On the pop side, the Stonewall Jukebox played Love Theme from Romeo and Juliet, and over-the-record Saccharine periodically cut by the Beatles, Get Back, or Elvis Presley's In the Ghetto. And all the new dances, the Boston Jerk, the Monkey, the Spider, were tried out with relish if the crowd was in a particularly campy mood, and the management was feeling loose enough. 10 or 15 dancers would line up to learn the latest ritual steps, beginning with a shouted, "Hit it, girls!" The chinos and penny loafers crowd pretty much stayed near the main bar, fraternizing with the queens, if at all, mostly on the dance floor. 2 queens can bump pussy, one of them explained, and I don't care how beefy and brawny the pussy is, and certainly not for a relationship. The age range at Stonewall was mostly late teens to early 30s early 30s. The over 35 crowd hung at Julius's, and the leather crowd, then in its infancy, at Keller's. There could also be seen at Stonewall just a sprinkling of a new kind of gay man beginning to emerge. The hippie, long-haired, bell-bottomed, and laid back, and likely to have weird, radical views. Very few women ever appeared at Stonewall. Sasha L. flatly declares that he can't remember any except for a few occasional fag hag, like blonde Frankie's straight friend Lucille, who lived with the doorman once at 123 and hung out at Stonewall. Or 1 or 2 dykes who looked almost like boys, but Chuck Shaheen, who spent most of the time at Stonewall, remembers, while acknowledging that the bar was 98% male, a few more lesbian customers than Sasha does, and of those number who were decidedly femme. One of those lesbians did go to Stonewall a few times, tagging along with some of her gay male friends. She recalls that she felt like a visitor. It wasn't as if the male patrons went out of their way to make her feel uncomfortable, but rather the territory was theirs and not hers. There didn't seem to be any hostility, but there didn't seem to be camaraderie. Sylvia Ray Rivera had been invited to Marsha P. Johnson's birthday party on June 27, 1969, but she decided not to go. It's not that she was mad at Marsha, but she simply felt strung out. She had been working as an accounting clerk in Jersey City chain store warehouse, keeping tally sheets of what the truckers took out. A good job, with a good boss, and it let her wear makeup whenever she feel like, but it was 11 to 7 shifts, Sundays through Thursdays, all-night stints that kept her away from her friends on the street, and decidedly short of cash she'd made from hustling. Yet, she wanted to clean up her act, start leading a normal life, but she hadn't counted on missing the money so much, or on her drug habit persisting, and the $67 a week in take-home pay just wasn't doing it. So she and her lover Gary decided to piece out their income with a side gig, passing bad checks, and on June 27th, they had just got back from papering Washington, D.C. The first news they heard on returning was of Judy Garland's funeral that very day, and how 20,000 people had waited up to 4 hours in the blistering heat to view her body at Frank E. Campbell's funeral home on Madison Avenue and 81st Street. The news sent a melodramatic shiver up Sylvia's spine, and she decided to become completely hysterical. "It's the end of an era," she tearfully announced. "The greatest singer, the greatest actress of my childhood. No more. Never again over the rainbow." Here Sylvia sobbed loudly. No one left to look up to. No, she was not going to Marcia's party. She was going to stay home, light her consoling religious candles, her grandmother, Vahida, had taught her that much, and say a few prayers for Judy. But then the phone rang, and her buddy, Tammy Novak, who sounded more stoned than usual, insisted Sylvia and Gary join her later that night at Stonewall. Sylvia hesitated. If she were going out at all, was it all right to dance with the martyred Judy, not cold yet in her grave? She would go to her favorite Washington Square, which had never been she had never been crazy about Stonewall, and reminded Tammy men in makeup were tolerated there, but not exactly cherished, and if they were going to go out, she wanted to vent, to be outrageous, as grief-stricken as makeup would allow, but Tammy absolutely refused to take no for an answer. And so Sylvia, moaning theatrically, gave in. She popped a Black Beauty, Speed, and she and Gary headed downtown. Jim Forrett's job at CBS required long hours, and he often got back to his apartment after a stopover at Max's Kansas City in the early mornings. On the night of June 27th, he had worked the office until midnight. He had gotten a nightcap at Max's at about 1 a.m. and headed back to his apartment in the Village, passing by the Stonewall Inn, a bar that he despised, insisting that it was a haven for marauding chicken hawks. Jim noticed a cluster of cops in front of the bar, looking as if they were about to enter. He shrugged it off as just another routine raid, and even found himself hoping that this time, Stonewall had been raided just 2 weeks before, the police would succeed in closing the joint. But as Jim got closer, he could see a small group of onlookers had gathered. That was somewhat surprising, since the first sign of a raid usually led to an immediate scattering. Typically, gays fled rather than loitered, and fled as quietly and as quickly as possible, grateful not to be implicated at the scene of the crime. Jim spotted Craig Rodwell at the top row of the steps leading to the brownstone, adjacent to the Stonewall Inn. Something was decidedly in the air. Craig had taken up his position only moments before. Like Jim, he had been on his way home from playing cards at a friend's, and had stumbled upon the gathering crowd in front of Stonewall. He was with Fred Sargent, his current lover, and the two of them had scrambled up the brownstone steps to get a better view. The crowd was decidedly small, but riveting, and it was strangely quiet, expectant air, as if awaiting the next development. Just then, the police pushed open the front door of the Stonewall Inn and marched. Craig looked at his watch. It was 1:20 a.m. Sylvia was feeling very little pain. The Black Beauty had hopped her up, and the scotch had smoothed her out. Her lover, Gary, had come along. Tammy, Bambi, and Ivan were there, and rumor had it that Marcia Johnson, disgusted at the no-shows for her birthday, also headed downtown to Stonewall, determined to party somewhere. It looked like a good night. Sylvia expansively decided that she did like the Stonewall after all, and was just saying that to Tammy, who looked as though she was about to keel over. That child, Tammy was 17, Sylvia was 18, could not control her intake when the cops came barreling through the front door. The white warning lights had earlier started flashing on the dance floor, but Sylvia and her friends had been oblivious. Next thing she knew, the cops, with their usual arrogance, were stomping through, ordering the patrons to line up, get their IDs ready for examination. "Oh my God," Sylvia shouted at Gary. "I didn't bring my ID!" Before she could panic, Gary reached into his pocket and produced her card. He had brought an alarm. "Oh, praise be to St. Barbara!" Sylvia shrieked, snatching the precious ID. If the raid went according to the usual pattern, only people arrested would be those without IDs. Those dressed in the clothes of the opposite gender and some or all of the employees. Everyone else would be let go with a few shoves and some contemptuous words. The bar would soon reopen and they would all be back dancing. It was annoying to have one's Friday night screwed up, but it was hardly unprecedented. Sylvia tried to take it in stride. She'd been through lots worse, and with her ID in her hand, nothing more than makeup on, she knew the hassling would be minimal. But she was pissed. The good high she had was gone, and her nerves felt as raw as when she had been crying over Judy earlier in the evening. She wished she had gone to Washington Square, a place she preferred anyway. She was sick of being treated like scum. I was just not in the mood, was how she later put it. I had got to the point where I didn't want to be bothered anymore. When one of the cops grabbed the ID out of her hand and asked her with a smirk if she was a boy or a girl, she almost swung at him. But Gary grabbed her hand in time. The cop gave her a shove towards the door and told her to get the hell out. Not all of the 200 or so people who were inside Stonewall fared that well. Chico, a 45-year-old patron who looked 60, was arrested for not having an ID and proving he was over 18. Another patron, who asked for some kind of ID like a birth certificate, said to the cop, "I don't happen to carry mine around with me. Do you have yours, officer?" The cop arrested him. 18-year-old Joey Day had been dancing for a while, and the guy in the suit had decided he wasn't interested, that he had tried to get away, and that the man had insisted that they go on dancing, but then, just as the police had come through the door, he pulled out his badge and told him that he was under arrest. Harry Beard, one of the dance floor waiters, had been coming off a 10-day amphetamine run, and was crashed out in one of the side room booths when police arrived. He knew that the only way to avoid arrest was to pretend that he was a customer, so he grabbed a drink off the bar, crossed his legs provocatively, and tried to act unconcerned. Fortunately for him, he had gone into one of the new unisex shops that very day and was wearing a soft pink blouse with ruffles on the wrists and down the front. One of the cops looked at him quizzically and said, "I know you! You work here!" Harry was on welfare at the time, so adopting his Nelliest tone, and he thrust his welfare card in the cops in reply and said, "Work here? Oh, don't be silly. I'm just a poor girl on welfare. Here's my welfare card. Besides, I wouldn't work at a toilet like this." The cop looked skeptical, but told Harry that he could leave. Stonewall management had always been tipped off by the police before the raid was due to take place. Actually, you know what? Hold on a second. I'm sorry about this, guys, but I'm going to need to be right back real fucking quick. I'm also going to run an ad break just so people can get ads, like, you know, as they're going in. Hold on a second. Nope. It's going to start in this... There we go. Alright, there we go. I'm back. Sorry about that. The 1 minute ad break has finished, and let me read some of the stuff. You didn't get a chance to respond earlier because you were in this, but when you heard Thel read out Frieson's message, you were confused because you thought it was part of the article. No, it's not. But it's understandable that you would think about it. Let me also find some music that's a little bit upbeat for while the cops start raiding the place, but still is sort of, but it still is sort of at least fitting. Let's see. Let's see. And thanks for the reading. No problem. No problem, Flash Gen. Thank you for showing up. Let's see, blues? I'm just gonna find, like, I'm just gonna do some blues, because I always feel like blues is a little bit, you know. Blues, royalty free, that's what it is. That's what I'm looking for. Let's see. No copyright. Let's go with this one. This one looks probably pretty good. Alright. We're gonna get the fuck back into it. Let's bust back on that web browse. There we are. And we're gonna play this. Yeah, that's probably a little bit better. Anyway. Stonewall management had always been tipped off by the police before a raid was due to take place. This happened on average once a month, and the raid itself was usually staged early enough in the evening to produce minimal commotion and allow for a quick reopening. Indeed, sometimes the raid consisted of little more than police striding arrogantly through the bar, then leaving with no arrests made. Given the size of the weekly payoff, the police had an understandable stake in keeping this golden calf alive. But this raid was different. It was carried out by 8 detectives from the 1st Division, only one of them in uniform, and the 6th Precinct, sorry, let me get this centered, there we go, had been asked to participate only at the last possible second. Moreover, the raid had occurred at 1:20 a.m., the height of the merriment, with no advance warning to the Stonewall management. Chuck Shaheen recalls some vague tip-off that a raid might happen, but since early evening hours had passed without incident. The management had dismissed the tip as inaccurate. There have been an abundance of theories to why the 6th Precinct failed on this occasion to alert the Stonewall's owner. One centers around the possibility that a payment had not been made on time or made at all. Another suggests that the extent of Stonewall's profit had recently become known to the police, and a 6th Precinct brass had decided, as prelude to its demand for a larger cut, to flex a little muscle. And yet a third explanation points to the possibility that the new commanding officer at the precinct was out of sympathy with payoffs, or hadn't yet learned how profitable they could be. But evidence has surfaced to suggest that the machinations of the 6th Precinct were in fact incidental to the raid. Ryder Fitzgerald, a sometime carpenter who had helped remodel the Stonewall interior and whose friends Willis and Elf, a straight hippie couple, lived rent-free in the apartment above the Stonewall in exchange for performing caretaker chores, was privy, the day after the raid, to a revealing conversation. Hold on. Ernie, one of Stonewall's mafia team, stormed around Willis and Elf's apartment, cursing out the 6th Precinct in Ryder's presence for having failed to provide a warning in time. And, in the course of his tirade, Ernie revealed that the raid had been inspired by federal agents. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, BATF, had apparently discovered that the liquor bottles used at the Stonewall had no federal stamps on them, which meant that they had been hijacked or bootlegged straight out of the distillery, putting Stonewall under surveillance. BATF then discovered the bar's corrupt alliance with the 6th Precinct. Thus, when the feds decided to launch a raid on Stonewall, they deliberately kept the local police in the dark until the unavoidable last minute. When the raid, contrary to expectations, did get going, the previous system put into the place by the mafia owners stood them in good stead. The strong front door brought needed time until the white lights had a chance to do their warnings work. Patrons instantly stopped dancing and touching. The bartenders took the money from the cigar boxes that served as kind of a cash register, jumped from behind the bar, and mingled inconspicuously with the customer. Maggie Jiggs, already known for her 2 at the bar, 1 for myself approach to cash, disappeared into the crowd with a cigar box full of money, and when a cop asked to see the contents, Maggie said it contained her tips as a cigarette girl, and they let her go. When later questioned by her employees, Maggie claimed that the cop had taken the box and the money. She got away with the lie. The standard mafia policy of putting gay employees on the door so they could take the heat while everyone else got their act together also paid off for the owners. Eddie Murphy managed to get out. Of course, his detractors had. He was on the police payroll. But Blonde Frankie was arrested. There was already a warrant outstanding for Frankie's arrest, purportedly for homicide. He was known for acting first and not bothering to think even later. Realizing that this was no ordinary raid, that this time and arresting might not merely mean detention for a few hours at Center Street followed by a quick release, Frankie was determined not to be taken in. The owners, Zucci and Mario, escaped through a back door connected to the office and were soon safely on the street in front of the Stonewall, so two were almost out of the bar's customers, released after their IDs had been checked and their attire deemed appropriate to their gender. A process accompanied, as in Sylvia's case, by derisive, ugly police banter. As for Fat Tony, at the time the raid took place, he had still not left his apartment on Waverly Place. A few blocks from the Stonewall, under the spell of methamphetamine, he had already spent 3 hours recombing his beard and agitatedly changing from one outfit to another, acting for all the world like one of those demented queens he vilified. He and Chuck Shaheen could see the commotion from their apartment window, but only after an emergency call from Mizuchi could Tony be persuaded to leave the apartment for the bar. Some of the campier patrons, emerging one by one from the Stonewall to find an unexpected crowd, took the opportunity to strike instant poses, starlet style, while onlookers whistled and shouted their applause meter ratings. But when a paddy wagon pulled up, the mood turned more somber, and it grew sullen when the police officers started to emerge from Stonewall with prisoners in tow and move them towards the waiting van. Jim Farrat, at the back of the crowd, Sylvia standing with Gary near the small park across the street from Stonewall, and Craig, perched on the top of the crowd, all sensed something unusual in the air. It all felt a kind of tensed expectancy. The police, 2 of whom were women, were oblivious to it initially. Everything up to that point had gone so routinely that they expected to see the crowd quickly disperse. Instead, a few people started to boo, and others pressed against the waiting van while the cops were standing near it, yelling angrily for the crowd to move back. According to Sylvia, you could feel the electricity going through people. You could actually feel it. People were getting really, really pissed and uptight. A guy in a dark red t-shirt danced in and out of the crowd shouting, "Nobody gonna fuck with me!" and "Ain't gonna take this shit!" The cops started loading their prisoners into the van. Among them, Blonde Frankie, the doorman. More people joined in the shouting. Sylvia spotted Tammy Novak, and the 3 queens lined up for the paddy wagon, along with others in the crowd, started yelling, "Tammy! Tammy!" Sylvia's shriek rising above the rest, but Tammy apparently didn't hear, and Sylvia guessed that she was too stoned to know what was even going on. Yet, when a cop shoved Tammy and told her to keep moving as he poked her with his club, Tammy told him to stop pushing, and when he didn't, she started swinging. From that point on, so much happened so quickly as to seem simultaneous. Jim Farrat insists that the explosive moment came down when, quote, a dyke dressed in men's clothing who had been visiting a male employee inside the bar started to act up as cops moved her towards the paddy wagon. According to Jim, the queens were acting like queens, throwing their change and giving lots of attitude and lip, but the dyke had to be more butch than the queens. So when the police moved her into the wagon, she got on the other side and started to rock it. Harry Beard, the Stonewall waiter who had been inside the bar, partially corroborates Jim's account, though differing on the moment of explosion. According to Beard, the cops had arrested the cross-dressed lesbian inside of her bar for not wearing the requisite 3 pieces of clothing appropriate to one's gender, mandated by Section 8877 of the New York Code of Criminal Procedure. As they let her out of the bar, so Beard's version goes, she complained that the handcuffs they had put her in were too tight. In response, one of the cops slammed her head with a nightstick. Seeing the cops hit her, people standing immediately outside the door started throwing coins at the police. But Craig Wadwell and a number of other eyewitnesses sharply contest the view that the arrest of a lesbian was the precipitating incident, or even that a lesbian had been present at the bar, and they skeptically ask why, if she did exist, she has never stepped forward to claim credit to the answer that she may long since have died. They ironically replied, and she never told another soul, and if she did, why haven't they stepped forward to claim credit for her? As if all this isn't muddle enough, those eyewitnesses who deny the lesbian claimant themselves divide over whether to give the palm to a queen, Tammy Novak being the leading candidate, or to one of the many ordinary gay male patrons of the bar. Craig Wadwell's view probably comes as close as we're likely going to get to the truth. A number of incidents were happening simultaneously. There was no one thing that happened or one person. There was just a flash of group, of mass anger. As the police, amid the growing crowd and mounting anger, continued to load prisoners into the van, Martin Boyce, an 18-year-old scared drag queen, saw a leg in nylons and sporting a high heel shoot out from the back of the paddy wagon onto the chest of a cop, throwing him backwards. Another queen then opened the door on the side of the wagon and jumped out. The cops chased and caught her, but Blonde Frankie quickly managed to engineer another escape from the van. Several queens successfully made their way out with him and were swallowed up by the crowd. Tammy Novak was one of them. She ran all the way to Joe Tish's apartment, where she holed up through the weekend. The police handcuffed the subsequent prisoners to the inside of the van, succeeding in driving away from the scene, booked them at the precinct house. Deputy Inspector Seymour Pine, the ranking officer, nervously told the departing police, "Just drop him off at the 6th precinct and hurry back!" From this point on, the melee broke out in several directions, swiftly mounted in intensity. The crowd, now in full cry, started screaming epithets at the police. "Pigs! Faggot cops!" Sylvia and Greg enthusiastically joined in. Sylvia shouting her lungs out. Craig letting go with a full-throated "Gay power!" One young gay Puerto Rican went fearlessly up to a policeman, yelled in his face, "What do you got against faggots? We don't do nothing to you!" Another teenager started kicking a cop, frequently missing as the cop held him at arm's length. One queen mashed an officer with her heel, knocking him down, grabbed his handcuff keys, freed herself, and passed the keys to another queen behind her. Holy shit, that fucking rules. By now, the crowd had swelled to a mob, and people were picking up and throwing whatever loose objects came to hand. Coins, bottles, cans, bricks from a nearby construction site. Someone even picked up dog shit from the street and threw it in the cops' direction. As the fever mounted, Zucchi overheard nervously asking Mario what the hell the crowd was upset about. The mafia or the police? "The police," Mario reassured him. Zucchi gave a big grin of release and decided to vent some stoned-up anger of his own. He egged on the bystanders in their effort to rip the damaged fire hydrant, and he persuaded a young kid named Timmy to throw the wire mesh garbage can nearby. Timmy was not much bigger than the can and had just come out the weekend before, but he gave it his all, and the can went sailing into the plate glass window, painted black and reinforced from behind by plywood, that stretched across the front of the stone wall. Stunned and frightened by the crowd's unexpected fury, the police, at the order of Deputy Inspector Pine, retreated inside the bar. Pine had been accustomed to 2 or 3 cops being able to handle with ease any number of cowering gays, but here the crowd wasn't cowering. It had routed 8 cops and made them run for cover. As Pine later said, "I've been in combat situations, but there was never any time that I felt more scared than them." With cops holed up inside the Stonewall, the crowd was now in control of the street, and it bellowed in triumph, a long, repressed rage. Craig dashed to a nearby phone, ever conscious of the need for publicity, for visibility, and for realizing that a critical moment had arrived. He called 3 daily papers, The Times, The Post, and the Daily News, and alerted them that a major news story was breaking. Then he ran to his apartment a few blocks away to get his camera. Jim Farrat also dashed to his phones to call his straight radical left friends to tell him that people were fighting the cops. It was just like in Newark. He urged them to rush down and lend their support, as he had long done for their causes. Then he went to the nearby 9th Circle and Julius's to try to get the patrons to come out into the streets, but none of them would. Nor did any of his straight radical friends show up. It taught Jim a bitter lesson about how low on the scale of priorities his erstwhile comrades ranked faggot concerns. Gary tried to persuade Sylvia to go home with him, to get a change of clothes. "Are you nuts?" she yelled. "I'm not missing a minute of this. It's the revolution." so Gary left to get his clothes for both of them. Blonde Frankie, meanwhile, perhaps taking his cue from Zucci, uprooted a loose parking meter and offered it for use as a battering ram against the Stonewall's door. As nearly the same moment, someone started squirting lighter fluid through the shadow glass window of the bar's facade, tossing in matches after it. Inspector Pine later referred to this as throwing Molotov cocktails into the place, but the only reality that described was the inflamed state of Pine's nerves. Still, the danger was very real, and the police were badly frightened. The shock to self-esteem had been stunning enough, and now, and now came an actual threat to physical safety. Dodging flying glass and missiles, Patrolman Gil Wiseman, the one cop in uniform, was hit near the eye with a shard and blood spurted out. With that, the fear turned abruptly to fury. 3 of the cops, led by Pine, ran to the front door, which had caved in from the battering ram, and started screaming threats at the crowd, thinking to cow it, but instead a rain of coins and bottles came down, and beer can glanced off Deputy Inspector Charles Smith's head. Pine lunged into the crowd, grabbed somebody around the waist, and pulled them back into the doorway, and then dragged him by the hair inside. Ironically, the prisoner was the well-known and heterosexual folk singer Dave Van Ronk. Earlier that night, Van Ronk had been in and out of the Lion's Head, a bar a few doors down from the Stonewall that catered to a noisy macho journalist crowd, scornful of the faggots down the block. Once the riot got going, the Lion's Head locked its door and management didn't want the faggots moaning and bleeding over the paying customers. As soon as Pine got Van Ronk back into the Stonewall, he angrily accused him of throwing the dangerous objects, a cue to Patrolman Wiseman to shout that Van Ronk was the one who had cut his eye, and then to start punching the singer hard while several other cops held him down. When Van Ronk looked as if he was going to pass out, the police handcuffed him, and Pine snapped, "All right, we book him for assault!" The cops then found a fire hose, wedged it into a crack in the door, and directed the spray at the crowd, thinking that it would certainly scatter it. But the stream was weak, and the crowd howled derisively, while inside the cops started slipping on the wet floor. A reporter from the Village Voice, Howard Smith, had retreated inside the bar when the police did. He later wrote that by that point in the evening, the sound filtering in didn't suggest dancing faggots anymore. It sounded like a powerful rage bent on vendetta. By now, Stonewall's front door was hanging wide open, with the plywood braced behind the windows splintered. It seemed only a matter of minutes before the howling mob would break in and wreak its vengeance. One cop armed himself with Tony the Sniff's baseball bat, the others drew guns, and Pine stationed several officers on either side of the corridor leading to the front door. One of them growled, "We'll shoot the first motherfucker that comes through this door!" At the moment, an arm reached through the shattered window, squirted more lighter fluid in the room, and threw in another lit match. This time the match caught, and there was a whoosh of flame standing only 10 feet away. Pine aimed his gun at the receding arm, he later said, that was prepared to shoot when he heard the sound of sirens coming down Christopher Street at 2:55 a.m. Pine had sent out the emergency signal 1041, a call for help to the fearsome tactical patrol force, and relief was now rounding the corner. The TPF was a highly trained, crack riot control unit that had been set up to respond to the proliferation of protests against the Vietnam War. Wearing helmets with visor, carrying an assorted weapons, included billy clubs and tear gas, its 24 members all seemed massively proportioned. They were a formidable sight, as, linked arm in arm, they came up Christopher Street in a wedge formation that suggested, by design, a Roman legion. In their path, rioters slowly retreated, but contrary to police expectations, did not break and run. Craig, for one, knelt down in the middle of the street with a camera he'd retrieved from his apartment and, determined to capture the moment, snapped photo after photo of the oncoming TPF minions. As troopers bore down on him, he scampered up and joined the hundreds who scattered above the billy clubs, and then raced around the block, doubled back behind the troopers, and then pelted them with debris. When the cops realized that there was a considerable crowd had simply reformed at their rear, they flailed out angrily at anyone who came within striking distance, but the protesters would not be cowed. The pattern repeated itself several times. The TPS would disperse the jeering mob, only to have it reform behind them, yelling taunts, tossing bottles and bricks, and setting fires and trash cans. When the police whirled around to reverse direction, at one point they found themselves face to face with their worst nightmare. a chorus line of mocking queers, their arms clasped around each other, kicking their heels in the air, Rockette style, and singing at the top of their sardonic voices, "We are the Stonewall Girls. We wear our hair in curls. We wear no underwear. We show our pubic hair. We wear our dungarees above our Nelly knees." It was a deliciously witty, contemptuous counterpoint to the TPF's brute force, a tactic that transformed an otherwise traditionally macho eye-for-eye combat that provided at least a glimpse of a different and revolutionary kind of consciousness. Perhaps that was exactly the moment Sylvia had in mind when she later said, "Something lifted off my shoulders." But, yes, hello, we see we are learning. Yeah, we learning today, kids. But the tactic incited the TPF to yet further violence, and they were badly beating up on one effeminate-looking boy, and a portion of the angry crowd surged in, snatched the boy away, and prevented the cops from reclaiming him. Elsewhere, a cop grabbed the wild Puerto Rican queen, lifted his arms up to club him, and instead of cowering, the queen yelled, "How would you like a big Spanish dick up your little Irish ass?" The nonplussed cop hesitated just long enough to give the queen time to run off into the crowd. The cops themselves hardly escaped scot-free. Someone managed to drop a concrete block on one of the parked police car. Nobody was injured, but the cops inside were shaken up. At another point, a gold-braided police officer who was being driven around to survey the action had a stack of wet garbage thrown at him through the open window of his car. A direct hit was scored, and soggy coffee grounds dripped down the officer's face as he tried to maintain a stoic expression. Still, later, some 100 people were being chased down Waverly Place by two cops. Someone in the crowd suddenly realized the unequal odds and started yelling, "There are two of them! Catch them! Rip their clothes off! Fuck them!" And the crowd took up the cry. The officers fled. Before the police finally succeeded in clearing the streets, for that evening only, it would turn out a considerable amount of blood had been shed, and among the undetermined number of people injured was Sylvia's friend Ivan Valentine, hit in the knee by a policeman's billy club and had 10 stitches taken out of St. Vincent's Hospital. A teenager named Lenny had his hand slammed into a car door, lost 2 fingers. 4 big cops beat up a young queen so badly there was evidence the cops singled out feminine boys that she bled simultaneously from her mouth and nose and ears. Craig, Sylvia, both escaped injury, and so did Jim, who hung back on the fringe of the crowd. There was so much blood splattered over Sylvia's blouse that at one point she had to go down to the piers and change into clean clothes. Gary, the Gary had brought back for her. 4 police officers were also hurt. Most of them sustained minor abrasions from kicks and bites, but Officer Hsu, who had been hit with a rolled-up newspaper, had fallen to the cement sidewalk and broken his wrist. When Craig had heard the news, he couldn't resist chuckling over what he called the symbolic justice of the injury. 13 people, including Dave Van Ronk, 7 of them while employees, were all booked at the 6th Precinct on charges ranging from harassment to resisting arrest to disorderly conduct. At 3:35 a.m., signals for 1041 was cancelled, and an uneasy calm settled over the area. It was not to last. Word of the confrontation sped through the gay grapevine all day Saturday. Moreover, all 3 of the dailies wrote about the riot. The Daily News put the story on page 1, and local television and radio reported it as well. The extensive coverage brought out the crowds just as Craig had predicted and had worked to achieve. All day Saturday, curious knots of people had gathered outside the bar to gape at the damage and warily celebrate the implausible fact that for once cops, not gays, had been routed. The police had left Stonewall in shambles. Jukeboxes, mirrors, and cigarette machines had been smashed. Phones were ripped out. Toilets were plugged up and overflowing, and shards of glass and debris littered the floors. According to at least one account, moreover, the police had pocketed all of the money from the jukeboxes, cigarette machines, and cash registers and safe. On the boarded-up front window that faced the street, anonymous protesters had scrawled signs and slogans. "They invaded our rights. There is all college boys and girls in here. Legalize gay bars. Support gay power." And newly emboldened same-gender couples were seen holding hands as they anxiously conferred about the meaning of these uncommon new assumptions. Something like a carnival, an outsized block party had gotten going by early Saturday evening in front of the Stonewall, while older conservative chinos and sweater gays watched warily, some disapprovingly from the sidelines, stars from previous nights' confrontation reappeared to pose campily for photographs. Hand-holding and kissing became endemic. Cheerleaders led the crowds in shout of gay power, and chorus lines repeatedly belted out refrains, "We are the girls from Stonewall!" But the cops, including tactical patrol force units, were out in force. They were not amused by the antics, and seemed grim-facedly determined not to have a repeat of Friday night's humiliation. The TPF lined up across the street from Stonewall, visors in place, batons and shields at the ready, when the fearless chorus line of queens insisted on yet another refrain, kicking their Nelly heels high in the air as if direct defiance. The TPF moved forward, ferociously pushing their nightsticks into the ribs of anyone who didn't jump immediately out of their path. But the crowd had grown too large to be easily cowed or controlled. Thousands of people were by now spilling over the sidewalks, including an indeterminate but sizable number of curious straights and sprinklings of street people who gleefully posed to join any kind of developing rampage. When the TPF tried to sweep people away from the front of Stonewall, the crowd simply repeated the previous night's strategy of temporarily retreating down the side street and then doubling back on the police. In Craig's part of the crowd, the idea took hold that blocking off Christopher Street, preventing any vehicular traffic from coming through, when an occasional car did try to bulldoze its way in, the crowd quickly surrounded it, rocking it back and forth so vigorously that the occupants soon proved more than happy to be allowed to retreat. Craig was enjoying all this hugely, until a taxi cab edged it around the corner from Greenwich Avenue, as the crowd gave the cab a viscerous rocking, and a frenzied queen jumped on top of it and started beating on the hood. Craig caught a glimpse inside and saw two terrified passengers and a driver who looked as if he were having a heart attack. Sylvia came on that same scene and gleefully cheered the queen on, but Craig realized that the cab held innocent people, not fag-hating cops, and he worked with others to free it from the crowd's grip so it could back out. From that point on, and in several parts of the crowd, simultaneously, all hell broke loose. Sylvia's friend Marsha P. Johnson climbed on top of a lamppost and dropped a bag with something heavy on it on a squad car parked directly below, shattering its windshield. Craig was only 6 feet away and saw the cops jump out of the car, grab some luckless soul who happened to be close at hand, and beat him badly. On nearby Gay Street, 3 or 4 cars filled with a wedding party were stopped in their tracks for a while, and somebody in the crowd shouted, "We have the right to marry too!" The unintimidated and decidedly amused passengers streamed back, angrily threatening to call the police, which produced some laughter. The police are already here, and more shouts until finally the wedding party was allowed to proceed. From the park side of Sheridan Square, a barrage of bottles and bricks, seemingly hundreds of them, apparently aimed at police line, rained down across the square, injuring several onlookers, but unfortunately no officers. Jim had returned to the Stonewall scene in the early evening when the bottle throwing started. He raced to the area, and it seemed to be coming from, and using his experience from previous street actions, tied to persuade the bottle tossers that they were playing a dangerous game, threatening the lives of protesters more than that of the police. They didn't seem to care. Jim identified them as straight anarchist types, weatherman types, determined to be readily butch about their anger, unlike those frightened sissies, to foment as a large-scale and gory a riot as possible. He then thought there were possibly crazies or police provocateurs. He then realized it would be ineffective to simply stop doing this, so as he tells it, tried to temper their behavior by appealing to their macho instincts, suggesting it would be even braver of them to throw their bottles from the front of the line. That way, if the police, taunted by the flying glass, charged the crowd, they could bear the brunt of the attack themselves. The argument didn't wash and the bottle throwing continued. If Jim didn't want people to actually get hurt, he did want to feed the riot. Still smoldering from the failure of his straight friends to show up the previous night, some of his closeted left-wing gay friends had also done nothing in response to his calls. He wanted this gay riot to be as good as any riot his straight one-time comrades had ever put together or participated in, and to that end, he carried with him the tools of the guerrilla trade, marvels to throw under the hooves of the contingent and mounted police that had now arrived, and pins to stick into the horse's flanks. But the cops needed no additional provocation. They had been determined from the beginning to quell the demonstration, and whatever cost, in bashed heads and shattered bones. Twice the police broke the ranks and charged into the crowd, flailing wildly with their nightsticks. 2 men were clubbed to the ground. Sporadic skirmishing went on until 4 a.m., when the police finally withdrew their units from the area. The next day, the New York Times insisted that Saturday night was less violent than Friday, even while describing the crowd as angrier. Sylvia, too, considered the first night to be the worst, but a number of others, including Craig, thought the second night was the more violent one, and that it marked a public assertion of a real anger by gay people that was just electric. When he got back to his apartment early Sunday morning, his anger and excitement still bubbling, Craig sat down, composed a one-page flyer, speaking in the name of the homophile youth movement, that had been founded. Craig headlined the flyer, "Get the Mafia and the Cops out of gay bars!" A rallying cry that would have chilled Zucchi. Using his own money, Craig printed out thousands of the flyers and set about organizing his 2-person teams. He had them out in the streets, leafing passersby to midday on Sunday. They weren't alone. After the second night of rioting, it had become clear to many that a major upheaval, a kind of seismic shift, was at hand, and brisk activity was developing in several quarters. But not all gays were pleased about the eruption of Stonewall. Those satisfied by, or at least habituated to, the status quo preferred to minimize or dismiss what was happening. Many wealthier gays, sunning at Fire Island or in the Hamptons for the weekend, either heard about the rioting and ignored it, as one of them later put it. No one at Fire Island Pines mentioned Stonewall, or caught up with the news belatedly, and when they did, they tend to characterize the events of Stonewall as regrettable, and as the demented carryings on of stoned tacky queens, precisely those elements in the gay world from whom they had long since disassociated themselves. Coming back into the city on Sunday night, the beach set might have hastened off to see the new stage on Caluda, or the film Midnight Cowboy, which Jon Voight played a 42nd Street hustler, titillated by such mainstream daring while oblivious or scornful of the real-life counterparts being acted out before their averted eyes. Indeed, some older gays, and not just the wealthy ones, even sided with the police, praising them for their restraint they had shown and not employing more violence against the protesters. As one of the leaders of the West Side discussion group reportedly said, "How can we expect the police to allow us to congregate? Let's face it, we're criminals. You can't allow criminals to congregate." Others applauded what they called the long overdue closing of what for years had been an unsightly sleaze joint. There are even tales that some of the customers at Julius's bar down the street from Stonewall had long been favored by older gays, the good girlies from the 50s, as one queen had put it, had actually held 3 of the rioters for the police. Along with Craig's team, there were others on the street. In the village that Sunday who had been galvanized into action and were trying to organize demonstrators or meetings. Left-wing radicals like Jim Farrat, thrilled with the lack of leadership and evidence during the 2 nights of rioting, saw the chance for a new kind of egalitarian gay organization to emerge. He hoped it would incorporate ideas about gender parity and rotating leadership from the burgeoning feminist movement, and build as well on the long-standing struggle of the black movement against racism. At the same time, Jim and his fellow gay radicals were not interested in being subsumed any longer under anyone else's banner. They had long fought for every worthy cause and other than their own, and the events at Stonewall had proven without any hope or that it felt was time to refocus their energies on themselves. The Mattachine Society had still another view. With its headquarters right down the street from the Stonewall Inn, the Mattachine was, in 1969, pretty much the creature of Dick Leistish, who had considerable sympathy for the New Left causes, but none for the challenges to his leadership. Randy Wicker, himself a pioneer activist and lately a critic of now joined forces with him to pronounce the events at Stonewall horrible. Wicker's earlier activism had been fueled by the notion that gays were just folks, just like the straights except for their sexual orientation. The sight, in his words, of screaming queens forming chorus lines and kicking went against everything that I wanted to think about homosexuals. That we were a bunch of drag queens in the village acting disorderly and tacky and cheap. On Sunday, those wandering by Stonewall saw a new sign on its boarded-up facade, this one printed in neat block letters. "We homosexuals plead with our people to please help maintain peaceful and quiet conduct on the streets of the village. Mattachine." The streets, that Sunday evening, stayed comparatively quiet, dominated by what one observer called tense watchfulness. Knots of the curious continued to congregate in front of Stonewall, and some of the primming and posing of the previous 2 nights was still in evidence. The police seemed spoiling for trouble. "Start something, faggot, just start something," one cop repeated over and over. "I'd like to break your ass wide open," a brave young man purportedly yelled. "What a Freudian comments, officer," and then scampered to safety. 2 other cops, cruising over in a police car, kept yelling obscenities at passerbys, trying to start a fight, and a third, standing at the corner of Christopher Street and Waverly Place, kept swinging his nightstick and making nasty remarks about the faggots. At 1 a.m., the TPF made largely uncontested sweep of the area. The crowds melted away. Allen Ginsberg strolled by, flashed the peace sign after seeing gay power scratched on the front of the Stonewall, expressed satisfaction to a Village Voice reporter. "We're one of the largest minorities in the country. 10%, you know. It's about time we did something to assert ourselves." By Sunday, some of the wreckage inside the bar had been cleaned up, and employees had been stationed down the street to coax patrons back in. "We're honest businessmen here. We're American-born boys. We run a legitimate joint here. There ain't nothing done wrong in this place. Everybody come and see." Never having been inside Stonewall, Ginsberg went in and briefly joined the handful of dancers. After emerging, he described the patrons as beautiful. "They've lost that wounded look that the fags had 10 years ago." Deputy Inspector Pine later echoed Ginsberg. "For those of us in public morals, things were completely changed. Suddenly, they were not submissive anymore." And now we get to Andrew Kopkind on Stonewall. Specifically, this is more just like this next bit is specifically about how things change. So yeah, this is a different one. This is a different person writing this. As revolutions go, the street fighting that took place around Sheridan Square in Greenwich Village on the night of June 27, 1969, lacked the splendor of Bastille in the sweep of Finland Station. State power did not crumble, great leaders did not appear, no clear objective was advanced, and a bunch of drag queens and their friends pulled from the Stonewall game bar in a police raid, refused to go docilely into paddy wagons, and all hell broke loose along Christopher Street and the adjoining parts and alleys. Fighting between the queens and the cops resumed, and on the next night, but it was the extent of the violence. And that was the extent of the violence. And yet, the Stonewall riot must count as a transformative moment of liberation, not only for homosexuals who were street fighters, but for the entire sexual culture which broke out of confinement that night as surely as gay people emerged from the closet. Why are those hyphen words that do not usually have them? That's just the guy's writing style. It's a thing that this guy does specifically in his articles. Stonewall was a material metaphor for the emergence, visibility, and pride, and its historic power had been its affirmation of gay identity rather than its establishment of a particular homosexual agenda. Unlike the national days of other communities, countries, and ethnic groups, the nationwide celebration of the anniversary of the riots memorializes an act of legitimization, not an act of parliament, a treaty, or a war. Gay Pride Week, the name for the observance, could hardly be more appropriate, although Stonewall came at the very end of a decade of conclusive change that was profoundly informed by the struggles of black Americans, women, radical students, and insurgent movement thought to be the Third World. It was in many ways a purist cultural revolution of them all, and the precursor of the postmodern politics of identity that proliferated in the decades to follow. Lesbians and gays are surely today's children of Stonewall, but many more are stepchildren or close cousins. That June night, almost a quarter of a century ago, now belongs to everyone. Essay was probably in the newspaper with small margin first. Oh, yeah, that's 100% it. That's it. Yes, this was specifically in a newspaper called Grand Street, which is where I'm reading it off of. The website that archives all of their stuff. It has taken a generation, or is it now 2, for the cultural significance of Stonewall to emerge from its own gay closet and be seen in light of social history of its time. this article was written in the 90s. I want you to remember, this article was written in the 90s. In the light of its social history of its time, because the event was so much of a revolution of personal identity and its natural that historians focus on details of personal experience, on the lives of participants, on the hilarious, humdrum, and sad details of an utterly incongruous melee. In the preceding excerpt, Martin Duberman tells the story of the riot's beginnings through the accounts of the band of barflies, bartenders, and bouncers, the drag, spear carriers, and politicals who happen to be in the same place on the same night and think of themselves as a historic happy few way back on the eve of their own private Agincourt. Lenin said somewhere that a revolution is a festival of the oppressed, and although Stonewall wasn't remotely Leninist in any other regard, it certainly was festive, and the crowd that poured out of the bar was definitely low down. The prominence of drag queens in the vanguard of the insurgency always made theoretical sense. As one of the most marginal, disdained, and isolated sectors of the homosexual world, it could not yet be called a gay community. The drags had the least to lose from acting out or acting up, and perhaps the most to gain. But as much as straight-appearing gay men, an epithet that still appears in the personal columns, kept their distance from the drag queens, or treated them only as camp objects of amusement, the chinos and penny loafer boys, as Duberman calls them, could see those qualities in the drags that were most despised by the straight world, were hidden in all homosexuals in one form or another. The most untempered, outrageous, and flamboyant behavior in the most oppressed was thus the most liberating expression of all. In the gay liberation movement that exploded after Stonewall, young lesbians and gay men were urged to get into their oppression, to comb the crannies of gay consciousness and sensibility, and feel solidarity with those who suffered the most. Stonewall was the beginning of something, but it was also the culmination of a long siege of the conflict during which protests had become a normal way of making politics. All sorts of sizes and groups had a bid for power. Many of the campaigns crossed communal lines, but there was a great deal of fear and a sense of threat, and sometimes an ardent nationalism that kept these groups apart. Stonewall is often described as a narrowly constructed, exclusively gay male happening in the 60s sense, but a lot of the lines were crossed. As Duberman points out, the drag contingent, at least, was remarkably integrated in racial lines, although the bar was not pointed as a lesbian hangout. Lesbians were sometimes in attendance, and one story suggests that a butch lesbian crossdresser might have been the instigator of the riot. Jim Farad, one of Duberman's witnesses, reported that he was unable to get his friends from the left to join in the second night of fighting, but if leftists didn't get it from the start, in less than a year, gay liberation was on the agenda at every radical event, and Farad himself, as a gay politico, was a star speaker at the legendary Free the Panthers rally on New Haven Green Day on May Day 1970, just 1 year after. Craig Wadwell, another witness, said in an earlier interview for the documentary film Before Stonewall that what was most magical about Stonewall riot was that everything came together that night. Somewhere in the existential depths of that brawl of screaming transvestites were all the anti-war marches, the sit-ins, the smoke-ins, the freedom rides, the bra burning, the levitation of the Pentagon, the endless meetings and broken hearts. Not only that, but the years of gay men and lesbians locking themselves in the windowless unnamed bars, writing dangerous, anonymous novels and articles, lying about their identity to their families, their bosses, their military, suffering silently when they were found out, hiding and seeking and winking at each other, or drinking and dying by themselves. And sometimes, not often, braving it out and surviving. It is absolutely astonishing to think that on one early summer's night in New York, that world ended and another began. So, that was The Night They Raided Stonewall by Martin Duberman. Now I'm going to go back to the script. So this article was written about the events that took place in 1969. We had like this thing that talked about the article from the position of a guy who republished it in the 90s, and now I'm going to talk about it from a position like here, now, right now, you know. Now this article was written about events that took place in 1969, but it was written in 1993, a year before I was born. And a lot has changed since it was written, both Obergefell, the case that legalized gay marriage, and Lawrence, the case that legalized gay sex, were passed after the article itself was written, at least the least recent of which was passed 10 years after the article was written, in 2003. Gay sex, to be clear, was not federally legal when the planes hit the towers. But let's look at now. June 28th, 2022. Recently, I'm actually just going to, stop the music here. Recently, the right has been laser focused on the culture war. The best way to explain what this means is that when interviewed in January and February of last year, 2021, most right-wingers had heard more about the Mr. Potato Head going woke than had heard about the impeachment of Donald Trump that was happening at the same time. The second impeachment. Now, most of these fights the right has picked have been disparate and haven't lasted more than a few weeks, disappearing into thin air when the next thing arrives. But within the last couple of months, they have picked a very specific target, and even more worryingly, a very specific talking point. That the LGBT community, specifically trans people, are an organization with the singular, explicit goal of grooming children into sex. This has created a wave of violence by the right towards the LGBTQ community, as figureheads like Tucker Carlson, Ben Shapiro, Alex Jones, etc. have begged people to do something about it, and they have. From assaulting drag shows to an attempted violent attack on a pride parade by the paramilitary group Patriot Front that was thankfully foiled, to even 2 days ago in Norway, a mass shooting took place at a gay bar in Oslo, making this a global problem. There were several catalysts to this. One, of course, being the TERF movement that has gained a lot of speed in the UK and has gained some very well-known proponents such as J.K. Rowling and Dave Chappelle taking an actively anti-trans stances that embolden the right. So with this, there is good news and there is bad news. We're going to go over the bad news first. The bad news is, I'm not going to lie to you. This is some scary, scary shit. This is the worst it has gotten since this article was written. It's the worst it has gotten in my lifetime. It is getting very, very dangerous for all of us, and this isn't something we can just brush off. Less than any other of the right-wing talking point, we can't brush this off more than any of the other right-wing talking points, because none of the rest of them have celebrity endorsements that are making liberals question if maybe the right is onto something with this. So we're going to need to fight this. And when I say fight, it might get to the point where this is not metaphorical, where we might need to physically square up and throw the fuck down like they did during Stonewall. So yeah, this is really bad. But Dave Chappelle, a little bit before this big uptick, so both of these started an upswing, but neither of them were really the catalyst for what we are seeing now with the right. What was a Gallup poll that made the right shit its pants. From the year 2020 to 2021, people who were interviewed and identified as LGBTQ went up almost 2 percentage points in 1 year. From roughly 5.6 to 7.1% of Americans identifying as LGBTQ. The highest it had gone up before that was less than half of a percentage point. The biggest demographical increase was with Gen Z, which in 2020, 10% identified as LGBTQ. In 2021, 20% dead. Twice as many. So this idea that the right had that people would eventually grow out of this or realize that they were wrong or that it was generally a small percentage of the population got crushed. And they said, we need to fucking do something about this now before it gets any worse. Because us gays are incredibly scary to the right. We fought the right on a somewhat different ground than a lot of other liberation movements did. Because when they said, God declares your actions sin and ours glorious and just, we didn't say, we disagree, God is siding with us on the matter. We said, we don't care. Go fuck yourself. Refusing to work within the most powerful moral institution in the United States and stating that its beliefs, if it refused to accept us, were immoral and shouldn't be listened to, and it worked.
By 2003, it was popular enough position that having gay sex could no longer get you arrested. By 2012, enough people were pro-gay rights that the Democrats made it part of its platform, and by 2015, the right to gay marriage was made legal everywhere in the states. And because the only thing the right could do was say, the church says it's bad, they got steamrolled. There was nothing they could do about it. So they just rolled over and told themselves that people will come around on the issue. And now that they realize they will not, their scared dog backed into a corner thinking it's now or never, because if that worked for the gays, it would work for everyone against any institution. And that still sounds like bad news, doesn't it? If they feel like they have nothing to lose, it makes them scary. But the thing is, we haven't been sitting pretty either. The LGBTQIA plus community has been rapidly growing and including more and more groups of people, asexuals, non-binary, pan, gender fluid. These have been around but have been talked about more openly in our spaces and are being more accepted. And more keep tumbling in and falling under our wing, which gives us a lot more power. The LGBTQIA plus community is inherently a political organization that I would best describe as a big union of people that the right thinks are sex perverts. Yes, this includes ace and arrow people. They think you're a freak for not wanting to fuck. And the bigger the union is, the more people that are part of it, the stronger it is. Gay men on their own are a pretty damn small number. But you add lesbians and you get a bigger one. Throw bisexual people in there and you're starting to get scary. And then the trans people show up too? Oh boy, now you got a movement. And we didn't stop there. They are scared now for a good reason. And not only that, there is something that while focused on us, the right has completely ignored, and something that should really be scaring them. The massive groundswell in unionization we've seen, and the amount of striking taking place. The right just isn't talking about that. And that might seem like a completely separate thing. It's not. Even outside of getting more gays in unions means more money in gay pockets, in previous decades, union might not have organized a general strike for gay rights, but we do not live in previous decades. The left, as of recent years, has gotten real intersectional. Here meaning that one cause's success or failure directly affects another one's. Racial justice, for instance, because if people of color, queers, can stand up and scream as loud as the rest of us without getting killed by the cops, we're all louder. And if the gays can make it so everything from gay sex to gender-affirming care is legal, then people of color have a lot less to worry about the courts giving them harsher sentence for. And if the people of color community and the gay community can stand for one another when the time comes, even when others' cause might not affect a lot of the community members, it makes all of us stronger. And I like to mostly talk strategically, but I do want to make it super clear. Standing up for any marginalized group is just always the correct thing to do. Like, it's just the morally good thing. That's the majority of the reason that we do it. And this goes into the current riots. As an AMAB dude who's in a serious gay relationship, access to abortion is probably never something I'm going to need to worry about. But I'm going to show as much support as I can for the people who do. One, because it's the right thing to do. Obviously, I cannot stress this enough how much we should just give a shit about this, but, two, because if I want queer liberation, this'll help. If they see someone like me showing up for them when Roe is taken down, then they'll show up for me when they come for Obergefell like they said they were going to. And to be clear, many of them already have, so at very least, it's time to pay up. And not only that, but this affects my fellow queers, right? I mean, there are a lot of AFAB people who are going to need access to abortion. Of course there are. So, we gotta do something about this shit. And for you, because I bet you're sitting there wondering, well, what can I do? What you can do is whatever you can. This can be as much as showing up to a protest, giving a ton of money in donations, or taking someone in when they need an abortion, or even something as small as just being there for someone who's really scared. You do not have the power to break the world. And this is something that I feel like we need to say a lot more in leftist circles. You do not have the power to completely change the world yourself. You and your small group of friends don't have the power to change the world yourself. But you do have the power to do whatever you do have the power to do. And to help others with whatever they have the power to do. And if everyone is doing a small little bit, then that small little bit turns into something that does have the power to change the world. And ultimately, that's the crux of the reason this story is important. This was a flashpoint moment that united queers against our oppressors. And if you're going to take one thing away from this stream, take this. The most powerful thing you can say is if you fuck with one of us, you fuck with all of us. And that's going to be the stream for today. The next stream I'm going to be doing is going to be tomorrow. It's going to be, of course, a very different stream because we're going to be playing Metal Gear Rising. Well, it's going to be a little bit, like, we're going to be playing Metal Gear Rising, and it's going to be a little bit less political than this one, which is very funny. But this one, it is currently the anniversary of when this happened, and I really wanted to read this stuff out and then like share a bunch of stuff. What time next time? Around the same time, 6, 7 around that time. But yeah. That was this stream. Thank you all for coming. I'm really happy to see, like, this is actually, like, currently we're up to 7 viewers, which is a lot better than I usually do. I'm really happy to see all of you here, and if you're watching it on the VOD and didn't show up, that's also fine. Just watch this whenever you can. Thank you everyone for showing, and I am going to head out. Metal Gear Rising, somehow shocker. Also, yes, thank you for reading the stream, though. Thank you. And thank you all for showing up. I will see you all next time, which will be tomorrow.